Hello and welcome to Intro to Photography Week 4. This week we're going to be talking about lighting, which is the crux of what makes photography interesting. Let's just take a moment and look at this amazing photo of Queen Elizabeth taken by photographer Annie Leibovitz. Notice how the light comes in from the window and just falls on Queen Elizabeth and illuminates her in comparison to that dark room. And because of that, she just sort of sparkles and dominates the picture, and we know she's the most important part of the picture because the light is falling on her and nothing else. So we're going to continue with our question, how do you make a good photo? And this week's edition is the lighting edition. When you are talking about lighting with photography, the goal is to illuminate your subject matter well. Whatever your subject matter is, you want to illuminate it well so that you can see the parts of the subject that you want to see. As always, the goal is to get a good exposure. So the exposure is the amount of light. So when you talk about lighting, you need to talk not just how it illuminates, but the amount you have. And one of the fun things about lighting is that it can do a lot to really create atmosphere and mood in your picture. So pay attention to how different types of lighting create that, and then utilize those to add that next level of what you're trying to convey and how you're communicating with your photograph. That it's not just about the subject matter, but you can convey an attitude or an emotion or a mood through how you use your lighting. So pay attention to your lighting. Notice what it does. So light can come from different directions. So how is the light falling on your subject? So when we talk about directional lighting, there's some different kinds. Front light means that the light is hitting your subject in the front. What this also means is that as a photographer, if you're facing your subject, the light is coming from behind you, behind your camera, so that it can hit the subject in the front. If you look at this portrait on the left, you'll notice that the lighting feels very even and it illuminates her face completely. There's not a lot of shadows. We see all the details, but it also sort of flattens her face a little bit. We don't see many interesting we don't see her form of her face very much. And there's not a lot of atmosphere or mood to the picture. If you look at the picture in the middle, this is a good example of side light. So side light just means that light is coming from the side. So it's from the side of the camera, but it also hits your subject on the side. Side light is fun because it can feel dramatic. It also shows the form of your object. If you have a three-dimensional object, like a face, it shows the form of the face really nicely because you see how the light falls across that form in an interesting way. Side light is often really fun light to work with. So it's a good one to play around with. And then if we look at the picture on the right, backlight. So backlight means that the light is coming from behind the subject and it illuminates the edge of the subject. A couple of things to keep in mind. The only reason that we can see the face of the person with this backlight is because there is an additional light source illuminating her face. If you only have a backlight, then you get what's called a silhouette, which is just a black object with an contour against a background. And also, if you don't have an interesting edge, backlight doesn't work very well, but the fuzziness of this hair makes the light really interesting. So backlight can create some of the most dramatic kinds of atmospheres. As we're talking about backlighting, I always like to talk about how do you make a bad photo? And one of the ways that you can do this is to shoot directly into the light source. When we talk about lighting in photography, we're talking about how the light falls across and illuminates your subject. We're not talking about how you can photograph the light source itself. Now, there is a place for sunset and sunrise pictures or including a lamp in your picture, but it's actually really hard to take good pictures of those. Um, and so, when we're dealing with beginning photography, it's best to leave the light source outside of the frame of your photo. So, don't include it in your photo. Why is this? Because what happens is the light source takes over your photo. Usually the light source turns pure white, so again, you get those hot spots that we want to avoid. And then the things next to it or the objects often turn too dark or even pure black. And so you can't see the details of what you're actually looking at. And you're drawn to the light, even though rarely it is the actual moment of emphasis. It's not what you want people to be looking at. You want them to be looking at your subject matter. Also, when you include the light in your photograph, the camera is reading that for part of the exposure, and since it sees that part of it is so bright, it has a tendency to make everything else dimmer. So when you take a picture with a light source in it, often you'll get a darker picture than you were intending. So what's the solution? Move the light or move yourself. So with this picture on the left, we actually have really interesting lighting coming from the window, but the lamp in the background is really distracting, right? And it's not illuminating this person's face at all. So what do? You turn it off, or even better, you move it out of the way so you get that really simple background in the background. Two really easy solutions. With the picture on the right, the direction of the light is actually really interesting and nice. So if you hold your hand up and cover the light, you can actually see how the light illuminates all these different toys and characters in the car, and the cars start to stand out a little bit better. So if the photographer had just been able to move the light, keep the main direction of the light, but move it over a little bit, or move him or herself to the right a little bit and create a slightly different angle of the photograph so the light isn't shooting directly into the camera, you'd actually get a nicer, more dramatic, really interesting picture. So one of the fun things about lighting is how it illuminates your subject, but also how the type of lighting can contribute to the mood or the atmosphere of the photo. So if we look at the photo on the left, it's got soft lighting, which illuminates the subject pretty evenly, but soft lighting has a tendency to feel a little bit more moody or a little bit more peaceful. If you just think through, like, it's got a softer atmosphere, so things that feel a little bit softer fit into that. The next picture over has side light, which we've talked about before, but side light can feel really dramatic, and it pulls out really interesting things. Side light is a lot of fun to work with. The next picture over is golden hour light. It is also side lighting, but it's a different kind of side lighting, so it creates a different quality. Golden hour happens right before the sun sets or right after the sun rises. And it's basically when the sun's rays are really long, they're just coming straight across the earth, and they get that golden quality to them and how they illuminate your object. So instead of taking a picture of the sunset or of the sunrise, you're turning around and saying, how is the sun illuminating? How is the quality of the light slightly different right now? You can also wait till the sun sets or right before it rises, and that's often called blue light. And instead of it feeling golden and glowy and kind of nostalgic, you sort of get this blue, cooler feeling. And that can be really fun to photograph with too. And then the picture on the right is bright light. So this is midday, the sun is shining, it is bright out. But bright light it feels cheerful, right? It's the middle of the day. When the sun is shining, we often feel cheerful, so bright light also feels that way. There's a lot of other kinds of lighting, so your textbook will walk you through different types of lighting and how to photograph with those types of lighting. But just pay attention, like how how you're using lighting can create this really interesting atmosphere in your photo. So if you're going for a certain atmosphere, find that kind of lighting or create that kind of lighting. So how do you control lighting? If you are using outdoor lighting, you're going to have to find it. You're going to have to watch your weather app, or you're going to have to wait for it. Is it the time of day? Is it the right weather? If you're using lighting that you can't control, it becomes a patience game. But it's worth it. A lot of photography is about waiting for that right moment. Generally, when we're talking about lighting, we're talking about exposure, and we want a good exposure, and that means you need enough light. The best way to do that is to get outside. I highly recommend taking as many photos for this class outside as possible. But another way to control lighting is to use fancy professional studio lights. So I'd like you to watch 2 very short videos this week about standard studio light setups for portraits. This studio light scenario can be used on people, but it can also be used on objects too. It can be used on still lifes. So don't think just because I've been using a lot of portrait examples this week, but lighting, how lighting works is not just on people. It can be on things, it can be on flowers. All those things matter. My guess is that most of you don't have access to professional studio lights. If you do, please, great, use them. That's wonderful. If not, you're going to have to use your house lights to approximate studio lighting. So do you have a lamp that you can move? Do you have 2 lamps that you could maybe put together, and those could be your key light, your strongest light? Can you corral a lot of things? Could you maybe use a paper bag or a piece of paper to soften the light? So moving lights around, creating different angles of lights, those are all things that can help you control the lighting. One thing you may find is that you've found a great light source, but there's light coming from other directions too. If you have a large piece of paper and maybe someone who's willing to help you, you can use that to block unwanted light. So you can just hold it up outside of the frame of the camera, but you'll see the difference on your subject, whether it's a face or a flower. If you put a piece of paper on one side, you're blocking the light from that side, and it will you'll see the light better from the other side, and that can be really nice. If you're finding that your light is too harsh, you can look into ways to diffuse it. So if you have studio lights, you can use soft boxes or shoot through umbrellas or use a reflector umbrella. But if you just have normal lamps at home, think about how you're using the lamp shade. Or again, do you have a somewhat see-through piece of paper that you can hold up to the lamp that will sort of spread the light out so that it isn't so harsh and so directional? You can also think about bouncing light. If you've ever seen a wedding or engagement photography session outside, often there's the photographer and then there's an assistant with a big round, it's called a reflector. And what they're doing is they're trying to bounce the light back into someone's face so that you don't get harsh shadows. Pay attention to shadows. Make sure that you're not acquiring any shadows that you don't want to acquire. So bouncing light, if you've got the sun coming in from one direction, you've got all sorts of weird light shadows coming, then hold a piece of paper on the other side that will bounce light into that side, and you'll spread the light out a little bit more nicely. When we talk about lighting, you often want to talk about night photography. So night photography is basically the situation where there's not enough light, but you still want to take a picture. So what do? So you will need to use a slower shutter speed, which means you need to use a tripod so that you don't capture camera shake or unwanted motion blur. And we'll talk about shutter speed next week, but basically a slower shutter speed allows you to absorb more light. But then another option is to boost your ISO. So what is your ISO? ISO is the measurement of how sensitive your camera's sensor is to the available light. It used to be a film thing. Film has been replaced by that digital sensor in your camera. So a low ISO means that your camera isn't sensitive to light, so you need good external light. However, one of the flip sides of ISO is that it also affects the texture of your photo. So when you have a low ISO, it's recording just a little bit slower, so it records more details, and that means you get a smoother picture. High ISO, so maybe 1600 or 3200 or even 6400, it can keep getting higher and higher and higher, means that it records it faster. So if you're in a low light scenario, because the camera records it faster, it actually can record more of what's going on. You see more of the light. However, if you get too high, you have a tendency to get a noisy or grainy texture. So if you look at this, whatever this image is, on the far right, you start to see those colors separating themselves. And that's that noisy graininess. That's not actually what the object is like. That's kind of an after effect of increasing your ISO too much. So a good rule of thumb is assume if you have good lighting, normal lighting, then you want a low ISO. A low ISO is always your best option because it's usually not good to get that noise, that graininess in your photo. But if you're in a low light scenario, you can start increasing your ISO because you'll find that it helps you. You'll see your scenario better. The exposure will come through a little bit nicer in your photo, and that's a good thing. So it's a balance of you don't want to boost it too much so that you get a bunch of noise, but you do want to boost it so you can actually see what's going on and get a good exposure. Another thing that we need to talk about when talking about lighting is white balance, which is the color of light. So pure white light is a perfect balance of all the colors. If you've ever studied the physics of light, pure white is a mixture of all the colors put together. But most light is not perfectly balanced. It has a color cast one way or the other. And usually you want to avoid a picture that has too much of that color cast. So often if you're indoors, you get a picture that's a little bit too yellow. So the opposite of yellow with light is blue. So if you get a picture that's too yellow, you want to balance with blue to balance out that light so it feels normal. So you can see that in that wedding picture. In the picture on the right, or the double picture on the right, should I say, the picture of the couple, the one on the left feels a little bit too blue, and sometimes that can happen with outdoor lighting, especially if it's cloudy or you're in the shade. Light can be a little bit too blue. So then you balance it with yellow to make the lighting feel a little bit more natural. So how do you do this? In your camera, there's a white balance setting, and I'll make another video that shows how to find that in your DSLR or your Camera Plus app. And generally, usually auto white balance works pretty well. But if you find that your auto white balance isn't working well, what you want to do is you want to set one of these lighting options. So you need to identify the kind of light you're currently in, and then you set that, and your camera will then balance it out for you. So again, outside light has a tendency to be a little bit bluer. So if you look at the daylight, cloudy, or shade options, the camera's going to add warm tones. And how much warmth it's going to add is kind of depending on each of these is increasingly blue, so to speak. So daylight has the least blue, shade has the most blue, so it will add the most warm tones. Tungsten, or sometimes referred to as incandescent lighting, is basically any yellow light. So your camera's going to add blue. So if you're seeing that your light is yellow, you set it to this setting, and then your camera will compensate accordingly. Fluorescent light, which is getting less and less, but has a tendency to feel green. So your camera will add red tones. So instead of that yellow-blue balance, this gets into the red and green balance. And you can balance it out that way. And then you can often find set custom balance if you want to, and that can be a nice way of doing it. Ultimately, pay attention to the picture you're getting and adjust accordingly if you need to adjust. Also know that unless you have a picture that is really harshly yellow or harshly blue, this is something that's also pretty easy to fix if it's just a small nudge one direction or the other when we do editing, and we'll do editing week 6. So that's a nice, some things are a lot harder to fix with editing, but white balance is something that's pretty easy to fix with editing. As we're talking about lighting, I want to do just a quick refresh of what do we mean by getting a good exposure. So exposure is the amount of light that your camera records, that you get in your photo. So how do you know you're getting the right exposure? So if you're on any automatic camera setting, your camera is basically, it's trying to get what it thinks is the right exposure. And sometimes that's great, and sometimes a camera can kind of misread an exposure. So if you look at this image on the bottom right, that's called an exposure meter. And when that little dial, that measurement is right on 0, basically that's your camera saying this is the right exposure. However, as we learned in week 1, if you move your camera around, that can affect your exposure. So if you set your exposure on different things, that can affect, if you set your focus on different things, that can affect your exposure. So we talked a little bit about exposure compensation. One thing you can do to always make sure you get a really good photo as a safety, so to speak, is to do something that's called bracketing. And bracketing just means that you're taking one photo that the camera says is the right exposure, quote unquote, and then one photo that is slightly underexposed, so a little bit darker, and one photo that's slightly overexposed, so a little bit lighter. And you end up with 3 photos of the exact same thing, but then you can decide, oh, I actually like this photo a little bit darker, or, oh, no, this photo needed to be a little bit lighter, and that is better. So ultimately, you are the decider of what is the right exposure, assuming that you don't get too dark or too light. After you take your picture, there's another indicator that can help you figure out if you've got a good amount of light in your picture, and this is called the histogram. So you can see this on the display. Sometimes this shows up in your info display on your DSLR. If you keep hitting display, you can see it for each individual picture. Sometimes you'll see it in Photoshop or other photo editing places. And basically, it's just a graph of where the pixels land in your picture. So this top graph here shows me that the majority of the pixels in this picture are mid-tones. So this picture isn't like super light or super dark. It's somewhere like kind of just in the middle. But this picture also has some interesting shadows and blacks. So you can see there's some more pixels down there and not as many pixels in the highlights and whites. So overall, this picture is a little bit on the darker side, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's underexposed. It could just mean that it's a picture of a flower with a black background, and the flower's mostly midtones, not a lot of like bright, and then the background is black, so that's why we get a lot of, which we want it to be black, so that's why we get a lot of those pixels. So some of it is kind of like, what kind of picture are you looking for? If you look at the histogram, you can see there's gray, sort of a gray graph, and then there's different other color graphs. So that just has to do with, the gray means all the pixels overall, and then the other colors are the different types of color. So you can see there's the red pixels, the green pixels, the blue pixels, and usually you just see the red, green, and blue, because those are the 3 light spectrums that you're working with. When you look at a histogram, one of the things you do want to watch for is that you don't The official term is called clipping. So you can see in the bottom diagram, the picture on the left has a lot of pixels all the way over to the left. And it basically means those pixels are pure black. There's no detail in those pictures. And the one on the right has pure white pixels. And again, we want to avoid these because you can't edit those. If a pixel is somewhere in the midtones or even the shadows or the highlights, you can kind of move it darker or lighter, or even adjust the color of that pixel. But once a pixel is white, it's always white. Once a pixel is black, it's always black. It's really hard to change those. So that's officially called clipping. Sometimes it's referred to as blowouts. So you've blown out the black, you've blown out the white. You can also blow out certain colors where it's just that pure saturated color. And again, it's hard to change. Sometimes it's referred to as hotspots. Hotspots are usually white. And your book refers to it as the blinkies, which again is those white areas. So those are all different terms, but it basically just means you've got some pure black or pure white, and it's going to be hard to edit those. So be careful with that. The histogram on the top, where they kind of start out low on either side and then build towards a nice bell curve. That's a really nice histogram. So for this week, what I want you to do is experiment with different lighting scenarios. So your book walks you through some lighting scenarios, and the videos walk you through some lighting scenarios. So look at your assignment sheet, and there's, I believe, 6 options that you can choose from, and I want you to pick 2 to experiment with. The subject is up to you, but think through what kind of light is going to best illuminate my subject. What kind of atmosphere do I want? You do not have to do the same subject matter for the 2. You can pick 2 different subject matters for 2 different lighting scenarios. But I really want to see how you're making use of that lighting to illuminate your subject really in an interesting way. So let's look at some inspiration. One of our moments of inspiration this week comes from Annie Leibovitz, which you are watching a video of her behind the scenes. She is an amazing portrait photographer. I've shown some of her work before. But notice how she creates atmosphere with her lighting. There is enough light, even though the overall picture feels a little bit darker, there's enough light, right? We can see the details of the face. We can see the details of the gargoyle. But the overall, because it's a little bit darker and a little bit bluer, it feels really moody, right? Which fits in with the overall atmosphere of the gargoyles and the pose of, I believe it's Angelina Jolie. So we get this really kind of interesting, dramatic, even though it's not harsh lighting, it's not that side lighting that we talked about creating drama, the pose and the overall atmosphere of the lighting do feel kind of dramatic. Let's look at another picture by Annie Leibovitz. One thing to notice here, so this makes use of a lot of studio lighting, but one key thing here is everyone is illuminated well, which is really hard to do when you have a group of people. Often people cast shadows on each other, or when you get people with different skin tones, it's easy to make some too light or some too dark. But one of the amazing things about this photo is that everyone feels like they're illuminated really well. And even though there's a lot of black clothing, it doesn't feel like there's clipping. So those areas of pure black, which means that we can see the texture in the clothing, we can see the way that it folds, we can see how there's different kinds of black in this picture. So it's a really, really impressive picture in terms of lighting, because there's a lot of lighting challenges in this picture. The other photographer I'd like to draw to your attention is Nicole Lee. She's kind of the opposite of Annie Leibovitz in that instead of using studio lights, she uses natural lighting. And she often uses this really dramatic side lighting that illuminates her subject in really interesting ways. So one of the things she often photographs is food, but she doesn't create this like beautiful, perfect arrangement of food. Instead, she sort of celebrates mess with her pictures. So you can see there's strawberry tops, the sugar is spread around, the one strawberry in the middle is kind of squished. Um, and even though she has definitely arranged this, it feels like a fun celebration of an imperfect life. Here's a picture that she took of, I believe it's her son. And again, you get that natural side lighting, which kind of makes it feel dramatic. And again, you get that mess, right? Like his face is dirty, and that feels approachable and fun. This is life as we know it. It's not a perfectly put together person like you see in Annie Leibovitz's photos. His inquisitive expression is really great in this picture. So, yeah, I just like the way that she uses lighting as she finds it, instead of like creating all these crazy studio setups. So both create really interesting lighting scenarios. As you go forth, look at how light illuminates things. Notice where it casts shadows, notice where it lightens things up, notice the atmosphere that it creates, and have fun finding those places that give you good lighting for your subject matter.